When the North American Free Trade Agreement came into force in 1994, it created the world's largest free trade bloc, comprised, of course, of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. That was then in a world ramping up trade globalization. Now, more than 2 decades on, and with a U.S. president who routinely calls Nafta, quote, the worst trade deal in history, the three countries are in the thick of renegotiating the pact. The second round of talks wrapped up this week, and with their take on the state of play, we welcome, in Washington, D.C., Mary Scott Greenwood, but everybody calls her Scotty. She's a principal at Denton's and the chief executive officer of the Canadian American Business Council. In Columbus, Ohio, Dan Utso, international trade lawyer with the cross-border firm Dickinson Wright. And here in studio, Mark Warner, principal and U.S.-Canadian trade lawyer at Maw Law, Linda McQuaig, journalist and co-author of The Trouble with Billionaires, and Brian Milner, Globe and Mail contributor and a longtime writer on global trade and economic issues. And we're delighted to welcome you guys here in the studio. And to our friends in Points Beyond in the United States, thanks for joining us tonight on TVO. Scotty, get us started here and just give us your assessment of where you think things are in the negotiations right now.
Well, Steve, things have only just started, and I think it's been pretty easy up until now, believe it or not. I think it's about to get challenging. I wouldn't want to be a Trump trade negotiator, because the president, if you don't know what the president's going to do, that's only next on trade. It's only because he doesn't know what he's going to do next on trade. He's all over the map in terms of his rhetoric, and that makes it really challenging for his own trade negotiators, let alone our friends in Canada and Mexico. So I think it's about to get really difficult. I think the Ottawa round will show some real tensions and some real splits, especially, for example, if we hear from the Commerce Department siding perhaps with Boeing against Bombardier, seeing what happens with softwood lumber. There are any number of disputes that could emerge in the forefront right as we enter the third round of negotiations. Okay.
Dan, what's your view on the state of play right now?
Well, it's wonderful to be with you, Steve, and I would agree with what Scotty said. I think, Labor Day is in the rearview mirror here in Columbus, Ohio, and that means two things. Number one, it's the start of football season, which is an organized religion here in our city, particularly with the Ohio State University Buckeyes, but also the Major League Baseball playoffs and World Series are right around the corner. And I think just like what we'll see later this fall in the World Series, the NAFTA is a 7-game series. Everybody knows game one. There's all types of pomp and circumstance. Beyonce sings the national anthem. There's fireworks. That's what we saw in Washington a couple of weeks ago. I think Mexico City's game two, where things really got down, where the negotiators, the players got to work and started to really move forward on this agenda. But I agree wholeheartedly with Scotty. Game 3, 4, and 5, starting in Ottawa in just a few weeks, is where the action is really going to happen. Keep in mind that there's a lot of discussion right now that the U.S. hasn't tabled a lot of the ideas and points that they want to raise. That all happens now. The U.S., under our procedural system, has to come back, talk to its international trade advisory groups, the private sector, which includes some of us and our clients as well, and then talk to the committees of jurisdiction. So I think over the next 2 to 3 weeks, you're really going to see some of the U.S. positions formalize, and those will be presented in Ottawa, and that's really where we'll start seeing the meat of the lineup as we move forward.
Okay, just one, admonition on that answer, and that is, as a Red Sox fan, don't get too presumptuous about the Cleveland Indians being in the World Series just yet. Just a word to the wise, Dan. Brian, your take on where things are at.
Steve?
Never mind.
The Blue Jays.
No, they're definitely not in it, I can guarantee you that.
Yes, and it's ruining the whole atmosphere for trade between the two countries.
It truly is.
The fact is that it's going exactly the way you'd expect, with the foreign ministers, the trade ministers saying great things. Oh, we've never been more cooperative. We're getting along on everything. And of course, we know that A, that's not true, and B, they're trying to do the easy stuff first, the stuff they actually can agree on. Here's what we do to extend the agreement. These are the areas we should cover. And everybody says, yeah, you're right, we should cover digital trade, for instance. And so they can say, we're agreeing on a lot of stuff. They don't and won't, and the hard stuff is really going to come soon.
What concerns you about the state of play right now, Linda?
Well, what concerns me is that we're always focused on this idea that what we want to do as Canadians is preserve the deal. And what concerns me is that we need changes in the deal. That the deal, the NAFTA, has been a real game changer in terms of strengthening corporate power and leaving workers more vulnerable. And I see nothing in the discussion that's going on, in the positions put forward, and in the negotiations, it's advancing the cause of workers getting empowered.
You do see the President of the United States, and we have heard the Prime Minister of Canada both say they are concerned about the state of the average worker in our two countries.
Absolutely.
Does that not give you any satisfaction?
It gives me satisfaction if we see results going in that direction. What we've seen in recent years with Nafta is a kind of hollowing out of our manufacturing sector in Canada. Particularly the auto industry, which is so incredibly important to Canadian workers. We've seen 25% of the workforce basically disappear and go down to Mexico. So to the extent that they end up addressing those kinds of issues, I will be encouraged, but I haven't seen that so far.
Mark, where are you on this?
I think it's going pretty much as you'd expect it to be at this stage. Part of what we have is the sort of what I'll call a natural timeline that Trump has presented, that if you take it seriously as a meaningful timeline, that will get people all excited. But as someone who's been involved in trade negotiations in various capacities, at the second round of meetings, you wouldn't expect it to be any further than where it is now. I mean, I guess, and you also would expect to see some posturing. We saw some posturing from the American administration. From my judgment, we've seen some posturing from Canada.
Should we play a little clip of that,
Sure.
actually? Here, let's
Sure.
play this, and then we'll continue with your answer. Sheldon, I'm on the bottom of page 1. President Trump on the free trade deal in Arizona last month. Roll the clip.
Personally, I don't think we can make a deal because we have been so badly taken advantage of. They have made such great deals, both of the countries, but in particular Mexico, that I don't think we can make a deal. So I think we'll end up probably terminating NAFTA at some point.
What impact, Mark, in your judgment, do statements like that have?
Well, they get people. What I'm going to say, standing back from this, I've been involved in this sort of world for about 30 years, and one of the things that has really changed is that negotiations of trade agreements have become much more public. People want a measure of transparency. It started in response to the multilateral agreement on investment at the OECD and then the Seattle ministerial meeting of the WTO. And so now what you have with technology, with Twitter, and with all of these 24-hour news cycles, people can project. So Trump is doing it. We just saw a clip. I would argue that the Canadian government is pretty healthy in the communications business on the NAFTA file. For instance, the story this weekend on maybe that Canada would want to see an end to the so-called right-to-work laws in the American South, something that will never happen, something that everyone who knows anything about trade knows will not happen. And so the only reason you would put that out in a newspaper story, I'm not even convinced it was actually tabled as a serious proposal at the table, but that's what we're seeing a lot. So we are where we normally would be, but there's a lot more posturing for the public, which is going to get people all excited. But I think as long as as folks at the table continue to work through the easy cases, and that for those of us who follow this stuff is building on the agenda that's baked into the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Some of that's pretty easy. And then over the next series of months, they'll have to work through the more difficult parts of the agenda, like the anti-dumping, countervailing duty, dispute settlement review system.
Let me just ask Scotty a real basic question off the top, and it relates to that clip we just heard from President Trump. He said he may just pull the plug on NAFTA, and I guess we need to know legally, can he do that?
Well, he can do that, sort of. I mean, Congress would have something to say about that, and there are differing opinions about who gets to control commerce in the United States. But I think the more important question, and Mark started to touch on it, Steve, is domestic politics. I have to give, particularly the Canadian government, a lot of credit to date for being really disciplined and really focused on what the agreement is about, how integrated our economies are, what that means for jobs and prosperity. And President Trump is not making it easy. It is really hard to resist reacting to some of the outrageous things that he says. And to date, the Canadian government and to some extent the Mexican government have been remarkably restrained in light of what they're taking on. It'll be really interesting to see if, as things progress, if they can keep that. Because, again, the president is prone to do anything. Just yesterday, he cut a deal with the Democratic congressional leadership on the debt ceiling and surprised Republicans. They were flabbergasted. They had no idea. There was no heads-up call. So the President of the United States does this on a pretty regular basis, including to his own trade negotiators. And it'll be interesting to see if our partners in these negotiations can keep cool and just keep their heads down and negotiate, or if at some point the political imperative will be to engage at that level. Setting aside your very good question, which is what legally can he do? And that'll be, if he tries to pull out, it's the beginning of a million lawsuits from now until the end of the time. And I know the lawyers on the phone like that, but anything that's full employment for lawyers might not be good public policy.
Steve, can I just jump in on one part of that? I think that I would describe the Canadian position as a little bit bipolar. Now, because I think for someone who focuses on the substance of this, we don't see the Prime Minister engaging in a lot of tweets. But when you go to the first meeting and say, by the way, we want to have climate change reference, which of course Trump's going to say no to the Paris Agreement. When you say, oh, by the way, like I mentioned before, we want to have the right to work laws. We want to deal with that on the table. Yep. Oh, Indigenous rights chapter, how about that one? So we've thrown some red meat on the table. So I think the notion that Canada's sitting there, innocently playing along while Trump is throwing all the bromides, I don't think that's the case.
Okay, fair enough. But Dan, sorry, let me just go to Dan on this part. Put us in the room. Do the negotiators care about what their political masters are actually saying for domestic consumption, or are they more focused on the task at hand and they can sort of, eliminate all that white noise, if you like?
Well, Steve, that's the question. And, by all accounts, what's been happening both in Washington and Mexico City is that the negotiators are having very cordial, friendly conversations and productive. In the first round, they were getting into the technical issues of rules of origin on chemicals and polymer issues, which really gets into the reeds on trade agreements. And so I think that we're seeing that within the rooms. Keep in mind that trade negotiators, us trade lawyers, we aren't people that have real active social lives. We're trade nerds. We didn't date a lot in high school. So when an opportunity comes around like this, that we're getting to work. I think the very real danger, however, is developing an agreement without being mindful of what the political rhetoric is outside of the room, not so much in withdrawal, but what led to that to somebody like President Trump becoming the president via voters here in Ohio and Michigan and Western Pennsylvania and elsewhere that are really looking for something big on trade to be done. We saw last week, or earlier this week, USTR Lighthizer say, we don't really have a plan for getting this passed. We're just not there yet on how we get this through Congress once it's there. And you start looking ahead to 2018, I'm very skeptical whether any agreement that comes out of this negotiation can get passed next year in the current political climate that we have. So I think while the negotiators are getting to work, at some point some decisions are going to have to be made as to what needs to be in this agreement to get it through the U.S. Congress as well as the Parliament of Canada and the Mexican Senate.
Linda.
But I think the interesting thing is that, as Dan refers to and you referred to, Steve, too, is that there are these tremendous dissatisfactions in American workers because of loss of jobs, primarily going to Mexico, not to Canada. The grievances with Mexico. There's a situation where Canada doesn't necessarily have to be terribly at odds with the United States in the sense that we both are suffering from this drain of jobs to Mexico. Now, my desire isn't to punish Mexico. I think we want to bring Mexican standards up, and therefore we need to strengthen labor standards all around, including in Mexico. But you could hearken back to, for instance, the Canada-U.S. Auto Pact that we had in 1965 and right through up until basically 2000. And what it did was say, if big car manufacturers want access to our Canadian market to sell their cars, they have to put production here.
You want to sell a car here? You got to make a car here.
You got to make a car here. What a great idea! It was became the backbone of the Canadian economy.
That was managed trade, though, as opposed to free trade.
Okay, but this so-called free trade isn't as free as it sounds. There's all kinds of restrictions on all kinds of things. But that kind of restriction, that domestic content requirement, was a brilliant idea. It was actually extremely good for the U.S. and Canada.
Do you think that's on the table in these talks?
I don't think it is sufficiently on the table. I think it's an incredibly important concept that worked extremely well and could work again.
Brian.
Well, this whole thing about all these manufacturing job losses, and we started hearing it even before the agreement came into effect in the early 90s. You know, Ross Perot's great sucking sound thing about 5 million jobs lost. A, that didn't happen, and B, yes, Canadian auto parts makers and U.S. assemblers did start moving production to Mexico. But by doing that, they made the industry overall way more competitive. So when the Asian producers started flooding the market, they actually could compete on price. If they don't do this, they don't compete on price, they lose way more market share, and those plants close anyway.
So you would be opposed to managed trade as opposed to freer trade.
The fact is that the industry has become more efficient in the region. And the job losses, yes, there are assembly jobs that they would have gone anyway, and they would have gone with automation and technology. Yes, they would have.
We're talking about 25%
Linda,
of the Canadian
a lot
auto
of those jobs would have gone anyway, and they would have not been able to compete with Asian exporters.
Some jobs go through automation. Some jobs disappeared because we had an overpriced Canadian dollar.
There are better jobs that have resulted in things like CAD/CAM and technology and design, and those jobs stayed in the U.S. and Canada.
Explain that to the 45,000 auto workers
Scotty wants
that have
in.
lost
Stand by,
their
everybody.
jobs.
Scotty wants in.
Well, no, I was just going to agree with the point that was just made that we have to be careful not to fall into the notion that NAFTA is responsible for everything bad that has happened in the economy in the last 23 years, because there are a lot of reasons that people have lost their jobs. And it is not free trade actually that causes the economy to get worse. We know that free trade actually makes us more competitive in the global marketplace. So I think we just have to be careful not to pin everything on NAFTA, both in terms of our hopes for what could be better or in terms of all the bad things that have happened in the last
having said that, Scotty,
having
said that, Scotty, we've heard what Linda has had to say about what issues and items she would like to see addressed in a new set of negotiations. Let me get you to weigh in on that as well. What do you think ought to be on this table that hadn't been there in the previous agreement?
Well, sure. Well, she mentioned domestic content, and I think that's a good idea if we could expand the definition of domestic content to include Canada and Mexico. So we would use the 1956 Defense Production Sharing Agreement, which says if you're in the defense sector and you're bidding on a Pentagon bid and you're Canadian, you have to be treated as domestic. Let's use that model and put it right across all sectors. I think that would be good.
How about improved labor standards?
We need to have.
How about improved labor or environmental standards?
Well, absolutely, particularly when it comes to Mexico. Linda's right. We have to raise the Mexican standards to be closer to the United States and Canada. But we also need regulatory cohesion. We need voluntary standards alignment. There are all sorts of things we need in this day and age that will make us more competitive with all the other trading blocks in the world. So regulatory cohesion is actually at the top of my list. It's not very sexy, but it would mean tens of millions of dollars back into the economy, Steve.
Mark, what about regulatory? First of all, you want to just give us a 30-second definition of what that means and whether you think it's valuable to include?
Sure. Well, people talk a lot about regulatory cooperation, so we would sort of have more of agreement on standards. Before you draft a regulation, you'd sort of, in the case of the Canada-EU trade agreement, you'd have a committee that would have a chance to look through some of these things and make comments on it. And so the idea is you try to get to more of a level playing field. Of course, we might not always agree because sometimes we'd be converging to an American standard. And so regulatory cooperation, while it sounds sexy and I believe in it and agree with it, I have a feeling, given the size differential between Canada and the United States, if we start showing up having to converge to their standards, that would get a lot of people upset in Canada.
Yeah, lower standards.
Well,
right, but that's not what we're
in every
proposing,
case. Like,
no.
the other is a Canadian, more of a Canadian issue than an American issue.
Dan, how would you gauge the appetite right now to improve the labor and/or environmental standards in a renegotiated North American free trade agreement? And do you suspect that the negotiators are actually focused on these two issues?
Well, I think that's going to be critically important, particularly a labor chapter revision to get it passed and secure votes through key members of Congress here in Ohio and Michigan, Western PA, Western New York, et cetera. I think we have to be careful, though, of just focusing in on as a labor provision in terms of organized labor. What I would suggest is really calling it a workforce provision. And that would include, number one, allowing workers that have skilled trades, for example, to move across the border. Right now, if you talk to any Canada-U.S. company, their biggest challenge is moving workers across the border. We're not talking about undocumented migrants, not refugees, but moving people. And it's a very tricky issue because of the political environment around immigration in the U.S. But we have to differentiate what the immigration discussion is here in the U.S. from moving employees that are already hired and working for companies. But because we do have operations on each side of the border and throughout North America, moving those people. So we have welders, tool and die workers, et cetera, on each side of the Canada-U.S. border that can't get to where the jobs are on the other side of the border because of we have an archaic and frankly antiquated immigration system in the Nafta. And then you have to look at bolstering labor standards in Mexico. I think that is going to be potentially the most difficult issue in this NAFTA discussion. It is a red line for Mexico.
Well,
you know, the idea that we would set a wage, they'll walk. Mexico will walk.
We're not talking about setting a wage. I think the important thing would be to give them proper unionization rights. One of the reasons that auto workers are so strong in Canada and the United States is they've been effectively able to unionize.
Well, actually, that's interesting because the growth of the automobile industry in the United States is in the American South.
Where there are not unions.
Where they're not unionized.
Yeah, but they started out as a highly organized.
But that's not where they are. That's not today's auto industry. So we're in 2017 now, right?
So, Mark, are you saying
because of the strength of the unionization in the northern parts, it's the same thing in Canada. Even the non-unionized parts of the industry benefit from that unionization.
Well, I don't know. That's not where the growth of the industry is. It's not in the unionized part of the United States.
Kind of end up matching.
If you remember when I was part of the Ontario government legal team when we were bailing out GM and Chrysler, and an awful large part of that was, the Americans on their side and us up here in Canada getting the two unions to realize that they had to roll back a lot of what they had to frankly get closer to where they were in the American South.
Can I understand your position on this? Are you saying that our negotiators ought not to put in a request that workers ought to be able to unionize more easily?
First of all, I'm not even convinced, wearing my American lawyer hat, that that's something that actually the federal government of the United States can do. Your case is winding through the United States at circuit courts and all of that. It's an odd request coming from Canada. Personally, I think that if it was really a request, and I'm not sure it was, I think it was an attempt to change the discussion from what I think is a more controversial issue for Canada, which is the discussion around the regional value content. Like in the cars, it's 62.5% in NAFTA. My guess is it's pretty clear that Trump wants one or two things: to raise that higher than 62.5, and maybe add an American U.S. content rule that flies alongside that. My guess is, the Mexicans will probably grudgingly go along with raising that content because they realize that we're competing against Asian competitors. The country that I think has more difficult to do with that this time around is Canada, because our auto parts producers have integrated already across the Mexican border, and they're quite happy with the status quo. So it seems to me that's a more difficult conversation for Canada to have, trigger conversation around labor rights.
Well, I think they would like a higher regional content, but they're not going to.
We would?
Canada, yes, but Canada's not going to go along with a "you must build it in America" clause in NAFTA. It's never going to happen.
What's interesting, though, is
how about you must build, if you sell in Canada, you must produce in Canada.
So those days are gone. Those days ended with the WTO agreement, so we're not going back.
Let's bring them back.
Well, you can't. It's too late for that.
They actually produce more cars in Canada.
Whatever agreement we have as a NAFTA or a regional trade agreement will have to comply with the rules of the WTO in order to even be authorized. So we have to stay in the real world. That's not even on the cards.
But you can structure it so that you get the same effect, whether you use the exact same laws.
I'm not sure you can.
Host jumping in here for a second. Scotty, I keep hearing that Americans say they want to get rid of Chapter 19 of the NAFTA. Yeah. Let's start with this. What is Chapter 19, and is that something that Canada should try to fight for?
Chapter 19 is the way you resolve disputes, or it's one of 3 chapters that you use to resolve disputes. And what Chapter 19 says is there will be a NAFTA panel, not just a U.S. court or a Canadian court or a Mexican court. And the idea is if you're a Canadian company in the United States, you don't want to get home cooked by a judge in Oklahoma or something, or anywhere, and vice versa in the other countries. So having a referee on the ice who's neutral is a pretty good idea. And Mexico and Canada are absolutely right to say we have to have dispute resolution mechanisms that take this out of a local court and put it into a more fair process. Now, what I would say is the U.S. wants to get rid of it because the U.S. wants everything resolved in local courts. The U.S. is looking for every advantage it can get, and that's the U.S. position. I think if you call it something else, I don't care if you call it whatever you want to call it, you do have to have a neutral referee on the ice, and that means it gets taken out of the local court. So Canada and Mexico are right. This is the deal breaker, in my opinion, for them. This is the thing that almost blew up the negotiations last time, 23 years ago. And I really, truly believe that Canada and Mexico will walk away from the table together if the U.S. doesn't come up with a creative solution on dispute resolution mechanism. And that's only one of 3 chapters. We can get into the other 2, Chapter 11 and Chapter 20. But that's the big one from the point of view of the negotiators at the moment.
Well, let me go to Brian on that. Scotty talked about some, unique or original or distinctive or something creative to figure out some new way to get around this issue.
Well,
is that doable?
I think the Americans already have the message that if there's no neutral arbitrator, that Canada and Mexico are not going to stick in there. Canada walked away from the free trade talks in 1987 when the Americans refused to do it in the first place. And Mulroney had the famous phone call with James Baker, who was Reagan's chief of staff, and he said, how can you treat your enemy, Gorbachev, better than you treat your best friend? And he said, if we don't have that deal, I'm not letting Simon Reisman go back to the table. And,
but they didn't get what the Canadians were after. They settled for less.
We got a dispute settlement mechanism.
No, we wanted common rules. We wanted guaranteed access, common rules.
Settlement rule.
Can I just back up? Because I think that's very useful to stop here and pause for. So going back to 87, what we got in 87 was an agreement with Chapter 19 and the free trade agreement that then got morphed into NAFTA. And then part of what was built into NAFTA was a working group that would look at working at common rules. Americans were never very serious about it. It lasted for about 7 years, expired. The key point I want to make here is that what changed, though, the critical thing that changed between 1987 and 1995 is the WTO. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, created a dispute settlement system that was fundamentally different than what existed in the world of 87. Now, there are a lot of older trade people who were around in the 80s who love them, respect them, but we have to be careful that we're not fighting the last war. Because the war we fought in 87 made total sense because it was a world before 95. So the other part of it that I think people need to realize is that when it comes to Chapter 19, Canada's been living essentially on a little bit of borrowed time. The status of Chapter 19 panels in American law has always been dodgy, and eventually it will be questioned.
Mark, though, I always heard, Frank McKenna, the former ambassador, our former ambassador to the United States, used to say, I don't know why the Americans are so upset about this. They win most of the time anyway.
Well, that's the thing. Canada wins a fair bit, but what they don't do is they don't honor the result, which is the other thing. So if you take a look at the last 5 years, there have only been 3 Chapter 19 cases involving Canada, okay? 3 in the last 5 years. The big ticket one is softwood lumber, and then we know what happens there. We win, Canada says feels good, we win, and the Americans say we don't care. And we sit down and we have to negotiate it bilaterally. So it may not be what a lot of the people who had their nice phone calls in 1987 thought it was. And so a trade agreement is a trade agreement. You're trading for something. My point is, call it a red flag if we want, but we better make sure that if we make that the red flag, we realize that we're not losing something else. Because if we're trading for something that's constitutional dodgy, we only escaped the constitutional challenge in the United States the last time round because we settled the softwood lumber agreement. The U.S. softwood lumber producer said, we'll go to the Supreme Court on this. And I got to tell you, they might win.
Sorry, Linda, you wanted to say.
Can I just pick up on, Scotty mentioned other chapters, Chapter 11. I think that is absolutely crucial.
What does that say?
Okay, that's the one that allows foreign investors, foreign corporations essentially, to sue Canadian governments if those governments put in place laws that infringe on their profitability. But those laws can be completely legitimate in areas of the environment or, health and safety, and they can still be challenged. And as a result of that, and then the cases are handled or adjudicated by these panels that are run by corporate lawyers, essentially. Canada, this is a complete infringement on sovereignty because these foreign corporations get to basically sue our government over putting in place laws that protect the Canadian public.
More often than not, though, Linda.
Can I just
Sorry.
quickly?
That's not exactly true.
Well, it is true,
Okay,
and in fact,
we're going to have Linda
Canada-
finish, and then we'll go to Dan.
Canada's been-
Hang on. Linda's going to
Canada's
finish, and then Dan.
been more sued than any other country on this, and
due
we've been sued
process.
more than 39 times, and we've paid out more than $190 million in
fines.
these cases. Yeah.
Okay, Dan, you wanted to say.
Well, the purpose of Chapter 11 originally, the investor-state dispute system, was put in essentially for Mexico. Was the idea if companies in the U.S. and Canada were going to invest in Mexico, that we didn't want Mexico to nationalize those companies and basically take over. So it was a way to drive some investment into Mexico. Now, Chapter 11 has been used by some plaintiffs' lawyers in particular to challenge environmental regulations. But what's important to remember is all it's saying is it's putting foreign investors, in this case, folks that invest in Canada that are from the United States, in the same place as they would be as a Canadian citizen, so that there's a forum to bring claims. I will note that I think the most aggressive
Canadian citizen.
No, I don't think that's true. There's no real evidence. You could bring an expropriation. A Canadian that is investing in the United States could bring an expropriation or taking claim in U.S. domestic fora in the same way that an American can. This just sets up a system that will recognize that in a much more expeditious way. I will tell you, over the next 2 weeks and all of the briefings we've received, this will be the most active area where U.S. trade associations are lobbying the U.S. Trade Representative's office, is to ensure that there is some type of investor-state dispute settlement provision in NAFTA 2.0. And I would just note on Chapter 19, I really don't understand why this is a red line. Mark talked about the issues of change between 1987 to the year 2017. The biggest change is that NAFTA has worked and that most companies now operate on each side of the Canada-U.S. border. So these really aren't judges in Oklahoma deciding. These would be U.S. federal judges at the U.S. Court of International Trade. These are life-tenured, senior status judges. So to suggest there's no data that Canada gets homered in any way, what it is it's a political solution that in order to get the NAFTA through Congress, Chapter 19 is synonymous with softwood lumber to many U.S. members of the Senate and Congress. So you're going to have to show that we're doing something on softwood. So it's more of a political issue than some type of policy issue. But to throw away your largest export market for 70% of your exports in Canada, 80% in Mexico over Chapter 19 it's an antiquated, archaic system that really needs revised.
Okay, jumping in here.
Declaring it a red line to me is foolish.
Jumping in, we got less than 5 minutes to go here. First, second, third. Comments?
Okay, back to Dan's point about Chapter 11. He's saying Canadians are empowered too. Who is empowered under Chapter 11 is corporations, whether they're Canadian or American. They get to sue the other government over laws that government's putting in place to protect its own citizens. That is just fundamentally anti-democratic. And there's absolutely no reason that needs to be part of it. That's nothing to do with trade.
Mark?
Well, it does, because trade and investment are linked. But the fundamental point is Canada wins more cases than we lose, frankly, in Chapter 11.
We paid out
and the point is that
$190
this is what's really important. The really sexy part of Chapter 11 that gets everyone excited, including people like Linda, is expropriation. We've not lost any cases on that. Okay?
No, I'm excited by the environmental stuff.
Where we lose is it's not really about the substance. Canada doesn't lose on substance, okay? Canada loses essentially on what we call the minimum standard of treatment, due process. Now, for me, I actually, as a Canadian citizen, I like the idea that our Canadian governments are asked to do things in a transparent way, to follow certain rules of procedure. And in the cases that we have lost, there are cases where our governments, and I've represented some in the past, have acted egregiously in basically changing the laws overnight that apply to a foreign player, as if we're in Castro's Cuba in the 60s. And that's not what our government should do.
We're not Simon Pierre on the side.
So if we don't want to get sued in those things, mostly it's a matter of getting our provincial governments, because we have the weird constitutional hook in Canada that the provinces aren't on the hook. It's the feds who have to pay.
Right. Okay,
so
hang on.
provinces don't care about due process.
Brian Milner and then Mary Scott.
Well, this argument about Chapter 11 is going to go on for quite a while, but the Canadian government has indicated they do want changes in Chapter 11. It's 19 they don't want to touch. And in terms of protecting foreign investors, they do need some form of protection. But Canada has that clause in 30 trade agreements now. Now, in its deal with the EU, the Germans didn't like that deal, and they have made some changes. And Canada says, well, maybe we can adopt that model in a revised NAFTA.
No chance.
Okay, well, that's everything tabled may have no chance, but some things will have to be give and take to get a deal done.
Okay, let me go to
If they
Scotty
don't like
Greenwood.
Chapter 19, just finish with it. If Americans don't like Chapter 19 because of sovereignty concerns, they're not going to accept a investor court system under Chapter 11. I know that's a fashionable thing for Canadians to talk about. Ain't going to happen.
Mark, I got to jump in because we're down to our last minute, and I want to give it to Scotty Greenwood to tell us what, in her estimation, will be the consequences if both of the negotiating teams, all three of the negotiating teams, can't come up with a deal.
Well, I think there's a strategy here, Steve, that says, let's stick with the status quo. I don't know if the status quo is possible. If it is, the status quo is not the worst thing in the world. The only way you want to have a NAFTA 2.0 is if you can make some improvements, if you can add a digital chapter, if you can achieve some of the things that you want to achieve. So I think there is some chance that if people can't agree, they'll agree to disagree, and we won't have a new trade agreement. I think that would be unfortunate because there is an opportunity here. If you set aside the hot rhetoric, there is an opportunity to create a modern trade agreement. The Trans-Pacific Partnership would have been that. Unfortunately, the United States has decided for the moment not to be part of that. So we don't get to play in that arena right now in the world of Donald Trump. But so I think there's an opportunity here to really come up with a new NAFTA agreement that deals with a lot of the modern economy issues, that deals with the workforce issues that Dan talked about, deals with regulations, but doesn't throw away the referee. You know, this notion that you don't want to advantage corporations, the whole agreement is about how we do commerce. That's who engages in trade. So we have to have referees on the field. That's dispute resolution. We've got to figure out how to do that. And we've got to figure out if we can modernize. If not, and if we revert to the status quo, that's okay.
I am the referee here, Scotty. Scotty, we need a referee, and that's got to be me right now because we're plumb out of time.
All right.
I want to thank our two guests from the USA, Mary Scott Greenwood and Dan Utso, for being there for us on the line from Washington and Columbus, Ohio, respectively, and to our friends here in the studio. A nice big wide shot from Mr. Director. Thanks so much, everybody. I never thought Chapter 19 or 30 or whatever, 11, could be such a sexy conversation as you all described it, but it totally was. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Steve.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.